You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
So Hayden, who's your team for Sydney?
Oh, dude, I got a great team for Sydney. I got Dr. Dan Mackay, the doctor's in the house, coming all the way from New Zealand to join, chasing that PTI. And then we've got Nick Butcher, who's, I think people know as Matt Rogers' testing partner, but Australian FAB royalty, as I like to call him. I know he doesn't like being called that.
I love how
Who's on your team?
So I got Mr. Markovic. He decided that it'd be more convenient to fly to Vegas rather than play the calling in Sydney, and then
He just didn't want to play with me.
Yeah, and then Sean Yang. We're excited. Very solid team. Hopefully, can finally pick up a dub. I feel very confident about winning this calling because, for once, Sasha can't knock me out of a calling. He can gift me the trophy this time. But anyway, episode 60 of Arsenal Pass. Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be diving deep just on Flesh and Blood game design, sort of the current state of the format, the future, scalability, just diving into the game, how it works, and sort of where we've been in the past and kind of where we are now in terms of how the game is actually playing out, the meta, but ultimately trying to sort of pinpoint on design, right? How is the design of Flesh and Blood evolved from Welcome to Wraith to where we are in Everfest? Because I think the game has changed quite significantly. And then sort of extrapolate that towards the future, right? What do we see as the future of Flesh and Blood? Just competitive play past that. But anyway, Hayden, go ahead.
I was just saying, I'm a bit of a passenger on this one. Brennan's, I think this is a topic you've wanted to cover for a while. And we've got someone joining us for the actual main part of the show, don't we?
Yep, it's going to be, speaking of the doctor, it's doctor number 2. It's going to be Tariq Patel. Tariq Patel is joining us.
The medical doctor.
Yeah, medical doctor. In just a moment, actually. But yeah, with this one, it's like, it's interesting because I think that I was actually talking to Hayden about this before we decided to move forward with the pod. It's like, we're looking to sort of have a discussion and not a debate. And obviously there's a lot of nuance to that statement, but I think sort of the essence of it is that I know that I don't think Tariq does, and you probably don't either, have a solid opinion on sort of what the current state of the game actually is. I think there needs to be some sort of exploratory talk and just like a sharing of ideas to even really understand what we think. Because, I have some ideas, but I think I have other ones at the same time that contradict. So I really need to flush it out more for myself. And I just really want to look towards the future because I think we're sort of at the apex right now. We've had our first Pro Tour, we're a few sets in, two supplemental sets, and we've seen a drastic change sort of in the evolution of Flesh and Blood, the gameplay, just how everything is playing out. And it's just wondering, like, what does the future look like and where does future design for the game actually take us?
Yep.
For sure. But before we dive into that, let's go ahead and head into the news, Mr. Dale.
Oh, see, I mucked you up a bit, didn't I? Because you were about to ask me how my week in Flesh and Blood was, and then I sidetracked you, I think.
Classic. What has been your week, right? It's just been testing for this Sydney calling.
I played a Pro Quest in the weekend, which was good fun.
Yeah.
Decided to bust out the dash list, and the dash list did win the Pro Quest I was at, but I wasn't the one playing it. So we threw the dash deck guide up on the Patreon last week. I think Friday evening, and one of our patrons who's local to me. He said he woke up early and he saw that it was up and he already been playing some boost dash and he was like, I'm gonna grab the list, I'm gonna run it. Shout out to Valentine. He beat me in an 80 card mirror in round 3, I think, and then he went on to win the whole event. So shout out to Valentine. But no, it was a well-run event here in Sydney. I like the local Pro Quests. I think there's some stalls that do a really good job of. They've built our community up and now they're running some awesome events. So Road to Nationals next, which we're going to talk about, and yeah, just some blitz testing. I've been enjoying it. I've been enjoying this blitz format. I think there's a lot of viable choices for the callings coming up, and that makes me excited.
Yeah, I wonder if we should crack that egg open. Maybe next week, right? I'm gonna get your thoughts
about next week.
Yeah, get your thoughts on Oldham specifically. I think that's like the big ideological divide in the Flesh and Blood sort of community right now when it comes to blitz. So for me, I played a ProQuest as well over here at Reaper Games. I did lose in top 8, but Yeah, I mean, it was a good event. There actually wasn't that many people. So usually those events would have 50 plus. Kind of at these ProQuests, we had about 25. I think it's for a few reasons. Actually, the least of which being the meta. But the most important one is the MetaZoo tournament. The big MetaZoo tournament was in Dallas on that weekend. And a lot of people are going to try to spike that. You know, some people successfully spiked it, but we're banned for talking, saying some comments on Twitter.
I mean, it's not even.
Yeah, I know. Just a ridiculous tournament. But yeah, a lot of people were over there. The ProQuest was fun. I played Chain. And yeah, there was hardly, I didn't play any Starvo myself, but there was hardly any Starvo at the tournament. There was like 2 players on it. We particularly had a Bolton Sabres just tearing up the field. My favorite part about there being one Bolton Sabres at a ProQuest is like every time in between rounds, maybe you're taking your bathroom break, you're walking outside, you just hear the grumbles of who got triple luminated last round. But yeah, heading down to Oklahoma this upcoming weekend to go steal Zach Bunn's trophies from his cold dead hands when I beat him in the finals. And I'm going to be playing another ProQuest, so a doubleheader, another one at Edmond Unplugged, which is a bit closer to me, also in Oklahoma, but just an awesome store. It's one of those stores that is also sort of like a lounge and a bar. It's one of the nicest stores, honestly. I think it actually is the nicest store I've ever seen up until now. So always fun to drive up there and play their ProQuest.
Very good.
Sweet. Well, now it's time for the news, sir.
Yeah, I'm going to rip straight into it. We've got, as we say, Dr. Patel joining us very soon. So, Road to Nationals it's funny whenever we have these like semi announcements for Flesh and Blood, because we get the retailer announcements before we get the official player announcements. I think it's something that LSS needs to look at, because we get these not announcements, but then everyone kind of knows about it, even though it's not on. You go to the webpage, you have to dig for it by looking at the retailer announcements. So anyway, we have the Road to Nationals coming up. It's going to be let's see, I've marked this up now. We talked about the dates last week. I think is it June 12th to the 2nd of July. It's basically 2 weeks after Uprising releases, and then into the second. Don't worry, I've got it here. Don't worry about that. I found it, Brendan. It's July 2nd to July 24th. Don't worry about June. July 2nd to July 24th. So it is 2 weeks after Uprising releases. And we're getting draft as a format for Road to Nationals, which is super cool. I'm super excited for this. So it's going to be draft and class constructed. The way the draft works is based on the number of players. You're going to play either 1 or 2, mostly 2 pods of draft, unless you have a very small player base. 2 drafts a pod, and then it's going to be basically Swiss in that. So draft your first pod, 3 rounds of Swiss. Draft your second pod, 3 rounds of Swiss. You can have 6 rounds of Swiss in total, and it's going to be a cut to top 8 for another draft, which is super, super awesome. You get Dromai, Phi, Islander, cold foils available for top 8, and a few other different prizes and stuff. And then, of course, top 4 qualify for Nationals, which I'm sure we're going to find out about soon. But because this is July, I think we're going to be back on for like September Nationals, maybe early October, and then Worlds, Brendan. Surely Worlds is coming in November, maybe early December. So very excited about that. Road to Nationals coming up. I'm excited to learn how else you can qualify for Nationals. I assume we're going to see XP qualifications for Nationals specifically, but we'll wait and see.
Draft
Week 2 of ProQuest. Yeah, what's that?
I said draft is good. Yeah, I also heard that news last weekend, and I couldn't be more excited. Like, I think that
it's cool.
Yeah, the back-to-back CC into like Road to Nationals into ProQuest kind of burns me out of the formats pretty quickly, but I'm very happy that they're now expanding into limited as a format for these Road to Nationals, and maybe in the future we'll see it at ProQuest. It keeps things fresh. Draft is a very, very fun and interesting format, especially over a long period of time.
They will. I mean, that was the point of the skirmish drafts season, right? Was to get that in and understand how they could make it work, and I think they've successfully done it. So super excited to see that now that's going to roll out to competitive events, not professional events just yet, but we'll see how that goes down the line. I think obviously at professional events like a Pro Tour, you can have draft pretty easily. We've seen that in other games. So yeah, interested to see what comes of that. Week 2 of ProQuest. There's a recap up on LS's website on fabtcg.com. The stats seem to be lagging a little bit behind in terms of like the events. I think we got the stats like literally the day of or Saturday of the ProQuest week 3, so we're lagging a little bit behind. But it's interesting to see just the kind of the evolution of this meta from Pro Tour to ProQuest week 1 to ProQuest week 2, and then anecdotally last week with ProQuest week 3. But we do have the data from ProQuest week 2 in which we saw it's like a really even split between Chain, Starvo, and Prism around the world, which is really interesting just in terms of what's being represented. And a lot of Lexi. Like Lexi is the fourth most played deck, and that's just continuing to build. So really interesting to see the meta develop. In terms of like the winners meta, it's also pretty evenly split between Chain and Bravo. Star of the show, Chain's about 30%, Bravo's about 33%. Prism not quite converting as high as, but it's converting about the same as people playing it, right? It's about 16% of the win share as well. So just some of these other decks like Lexi and things that are getting some representation and the meta aren't getting the win share, unfortunately. But yeah, really interesting. You can go check that out. It's up on fabtcg.com and see what's happening with week 2. I'm sure we'll get week 3 stats soon. And we're coming to the last week of ProQuest this weekend. You've got a double header, Brennan. I've also got a double header. I think I'm going to go to both. I'm also trying to have a bit of downtime during this ProQuest season because it's just going to ramp straight back up again, isn't it? So we'll see what happens. Classic Battles is out. We talked about this last week. We've now seen all the cards in this. I think it's a really good balance of a few cards for Blitz if you are looking to pick these up. Just, you want some of there's the foil heroes. There's also some new cards. Is it Glistening Steelblade? Is that what the new card's called? That card's pretty strong, Brendan.
Yeah, it is pretty strong. Honestly, I didn't see anything particularly interesting in Brute. I could be missing one card, maybe. But Warrior has some tools, right? Like the new Dawnblade is particularly interesting, the new hero. But yeah, that specialization is powerful. The thing is, yeah, so that specialization actually made me want to take another look at Warrior, but then I'm like, okay, so it's nice to have persistent counters on your weapon. Like obviously that's very powerful, but like what does this actually let you do? It's like it kind of is a card that lets you go long, and it's like if the Blitz format is still a 2 to 3 turn format, which I'm sure we're going to break down next week in preparation for these Team Blitz events, is that where you want to be? But obviously a very, very powerful specialization that Dorinthia got, so that's exciting. I had a chance to actually play this, these box battles, and yeah, it's fun.
Yes, you've got an opinion on this, right? Because I've got a box that I need to go pick up, and then I need to solve the conundrum, because you and Sasha are at odds about which deck you think is quite significantly the better of the two in the box, right?
Yeah, so I think it's Dorinthia favored, not even close, and Sasha is just a diehard Brute. I just I'm kidding. It's totally.
Am I gonna lean?
It's totally the other way around. Actually, I'm just trying to tilt Sasha if he ever listens to this. But yeah, I'm actually not too sure what's favored. The Rhino the Rhino deck is quite powerful. But you just need kind of a few cards. But yeah, if you get the Intimidates, like you get the Barraging Beatdowns with the Alpha Rampage, or even it doesn't even have to be. It's not even a setup, right? You just draw sort of a triple or quad Intimidate, it ends the game pretty quickly, just like Brute would in normal Blitz. But that Dorinthia deck is pretty powerful. We do see the new Bauble, which is exciting.
That's cool. Yep. And then some of these like generic defense reactions, some cool stuff in there. So yeah, I did get a PM actually about your Brute play on the Arsenal Pass stream with Sasha the other day. So
pretty
apparently you're trying to tank the stock of Brutes, which is that's just rude.
I think so we played on stream. And I think I had a million technical difficulties. Ridiculous. I was looking at 3 screens, and like Sasha's microphone had like a level 5 tornado in the background. I'm just like, dude, I just could not play. It was ridiculous. But Brute is definitely powerful.
Yeah. No, but I think a good balance between a great entry level product, as we said last week, and some cards for Blitz, even Class Constructed. Like you can play Glistening Steelblade and Class Constructed, right? So
It's a little bit expensive, though. I have to put that in there. It's a little bit expensive.
I agree.
Yeah, because I know that people are going to come in. They're going to be like, you didn't talk about... Yeah, okay. It's a little bit expensive. I'm there with you. But, we can take one, baby steps forward. But, yeah, it's pretty pricey. I think it was like $50 for me. But, yeah, other than that, cool product. I like the idea of dual decks. Dual decks is actually how I got into Magic the Gathering. So, I think it's a great product.
Got a lot of people in, yeah. And if you do want to check out some gameplay with these new battles, I keep calling them battle deck, classic battle decks, then Fabrica are actually doing, if everyone knows Fabrica, do amazing quality gameplay in terms of their production values are amazing. And they're doing a series with LSS up on fabtcg.com in celebration of this launch of the classic battle. So you can go and watch their gameplays. I think there's 2 matches up right now. And they're actually running some of these decks into like baseline entry-level Blitz decks of other heroes. I think there's like a Levia match last week, so be sure to go and check that out. Uprising World Premiere is next weekend. Brendan, I can't believe it's already here. We're going to be playing a calling. We're going to be playing a World Premiere on Friday. I didn't get the chance to do this in Vegas. I wasn't in Vegas, but so this is going to be my first World Premiere of a set. Super excited for it. Really pumped. You're, of course, going to be in Vegas. I'm going to be in Sydney. come say hello. Really looking forward to just jamming games, and both the premiere is really exciting, but also a team event is really exciting. So I feel like I'm just going to have an amazing weekend, results aside, probably.
Not the old O2 drop. So we got doubleheader deck techs. Hayden, you did a dash deck tech, which is already up on YouTube in the Patreon. I recently recorded a deck tech with Tyler Horsepool, so we have his Prism deck coming up on a YouTube video, and he's been kind enough to write a additional piece, an article with a sideboard guide, some tips and tricks. It's going to be going up on Patreon if you want to dig a little bit deeper. But his list, how to play it, and just like his general sort of, I guess, beginner tips on how to pick up the deck and be successful, that is going to be in the YouTube video, so definitely check that out. Get into the mind of a master, a man who's taken Prism to reasonable success. Obviously, winning Vegas was pretty good success, and then he was doing very well on day one of the Pro Tour. I think that he's taken, like what I was gonna say, he's taken Prism to success in formats where, I might not have had as much faith. But
where Brendan disagrees.
Yeah, so Tyler Horspool has consistently proven me wrong. So yeah, check it out. You get to pick up see the deck from his eyes, which obviously is much more effective than mine.
I heard he's changing his Twitter bio to Las Vegas calling champion Brendan is wrong. That's what I heard. So.
Well, that would be definitely on brand with his winning interview. If you remember.
I do. It's great.
All right, Hayden. I just got back from a bike ride. It's about 100 degrees out here, so we don't even need a grill. We can just throw this eggie on the concrete, cook it up. But why don't you take me in that CNC section, buddy?
Yeah, Commander Cookout. Question this week is great question. If you want to get your question in, you can submit them to us via email, arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. In the YouTube comments, let us know it's a Commander Cookout question. You can DM us on Twitter. You can tweet at us. Or if you're in our community Discord, our patrons Discord, you can also drop the question in our Commander Cookout channel, which is where we take this question from. We get a lot of great questions. This comes from Thalivix. People win their Discord names. I don't know. Some of these are like inside jokes or like, references to when they were 10 years old. And I just, hopefully this isn't their name.
Yeah. What if this is his first and last name? He's like, wow, that's offensive.
Yeah. Then I profusely apologize. Given the reach of people like yourselves and Tariq Patel, do you think it's fair to recommend that people don't play a certain deck for the PT and then play something that benefits from that advice? So, great question. And look, I wanted to answer this question. I wasn't sure if Tariq was going to be joining us for this question, but the first thing I want to say is this question has come about for a very particular reason. And also, I just think this is important to address because this is something that me and Brendan have been talking about probably for like basically the whole life of Arsenal Pass. And just want to say, first of all, before I get you to answer the question, Brendan, that I never think that Tariq ever had bad intentions with the brick-brack chain list. I think he genuinely thinks chain is the best deck in the format, or the best choice for the PT at least. But in saying that, a week before the PT, it's a long time in testing before the PT, so it's a very delicate balance. But anyway, Brendan, I'm going to pass to you to answer the question.
I love that I get to answer this question.
I can start if you want.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, right? So, do I think that people who have influence, whether they be channels or individuals, should encourage the community to play decks that are actively bad into the decks that they're bringing? Well, no, that's probably not the most ethical thing to do. That being said, it happens, and I think that most of the times it's not going to be intentional. So I know the thing is like Tariq got a lot of flack for this because knick-knack, brick-brack, chain, and then he played Starvo, like whatever. I think that you could have accused me of the same thing to an extent because I talked a lot of trash about Prism, but Prism ended up being good into the format. It was actually very good into my deck, so you could say, oh, Brendan trash talked Prism because he was planning on playing Kano, which is absolutely not the case, right? These things can just happen by accident. We were actually accused of it a long time ago. We received a lot of flack, and I know that we've kind of tailored our language and changed the way that we approach sort of recommendations for decks, the meta, and things like that, due to the way that information can be received. So I think that while it's not always on purpose, as a content creator, you have to be very cognizant of the possibility of this and sort of, I don't know, be careful with sort of how you go about it. But I think that there's responsibility on both ends, right? Like, part of the time, the content creator will be the fault, but part of the time I think that the community goes a little bit too hard because it can just be an honest mistake. And you can genuinely believe something. And in 1 week of testing, especially if you're in-person testing, let's say you're doing it like, I don't know, 8-10 hours a day. I think your entire understanding of the game can change in that time. It's pretty incredible.
A lot changes.
Yeah. How much?
Changes.
Yeah. I mean, I can even speak from our internal testing. Like we were on chain until like the 11th hour. And we've flip-flopped and reinvented the wheel probably 5 times in the 7 days leading up to that tournament. That's just kind of how it goes, right? And we ended up on this deck Kano, and we didn't talk about Kano, right? Because it was genuinely not that good in our tournament, in our testing. We had it for the Viserai format. It was performing okay, and it was struggling into like literally everything that wasn't Viserai. And it wasn't until we made a few card changes and sort of really honed in on like what we were trying to do with the deck that it was actually starting to see a decent performance. But yeah, I think that's kind of my answer, is that there's responsibility on both ends, but mainly as a content creator, you have to be sort of cognizant of the impact that your wards can have.
Yeah, I think we have like whether it be us, whether it be any channel out there, to be honest, whether they're purely competitive focused or not, or content creator who is purely focused on it, anything you say is going to be analyzed and is going to be taken in. And I mean, that's part of the reason that you're having the stool to stand on in the first place, is because people respect and want to hear what you have to say. So I think it's part of our responsibility, as Brendan says, as players, as creators, players who create content, to speak about the things that we truly believe in. And that's what we do on a week-to-week basis. Going into the PT, I thought Chain was the best choice of the sort of the decks available. I wouldn't have recommended anyone to play Dash. I talked about Dash a little bit. I wasn't going to share a list. I wasn't going to recommend anyone to play it because I genuinely don't think in good conscience I could. People would be pretty upset about that, I think, to be fair, because I don't think necessarily it was a great choice, but it was a personal choice that I was pretty close to making. So there's like things where, yeah, as you say, Brendan, you have to be really careful. And like you say, we've talked about like language reuse and stuff, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we share the thoughts that we have and be open about those. There might be very specific things that we don't go into because we have a group of players in testing who have come up with things, and that's not, in all honesty, that's not ours to share. But we do have very firm opinions on things and things we find out through testing, and those are the things that we're going to continue to share and talk about. And I think things like these happen, and for instance, for Tariq, I'm sure he'll take a learning away for that. I think we all take a learning away from that for sure. So yeah, it doesn't deter anything, I don't think, which is good as well, because I think, like you say, responsibility on both sides, right? Like I think Tariq does a great service for the game. He talked about it in ProQuest season, the decks he was going to play. He talked about the format. He writes a lot of content for the game, does a lot of good for the game. So I think it's important to understand that.
Yeah, I think that one thing that we learned after we sort of went through that process was managing expectations. I think we make it very clear in our content that if you're trying to win a pro tour, this is not the content for you. Like, we're not going to give you the best deck that can win the pro tour with little to no effort. One, because it doesn't exist, and two, if we had it, we would go win the pro tour. Like Arsenal Pass is sort of predicated on us being competitive players, and that doesn't mean that we hide everything or that we're sharking but when it comes to a pro tour or world championships, it's not even me and Hayden who don't want to give you the information, right? It's like we have a responsibility to our team and the people that we test with, not to come on here on our podcast and just give out, private information that maybe we didn't even discover. So, like, I think that we make it very clear that that is not our intention. We're not trying to give out a deck that you can just pick up and go win a PT with. And there's a lot of things that limit us and make us sort of take that approach, but I think it's really effective, right? And I think that just being clear about it, being upfront, is probably the best way to manage it, because mistakes are going to happen, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to say Prism sucks, but Prism just happens to dunk on Kano, right? Like,
I won't be saying it sucks. I think there's an even bigger responsibility that we have, and that's something that we are always committed to, and that's that we will never mislead. Like we're never out here to actively mislead people. It's just us as people, we're never going to do that, but also it's not something that we ever want to do. So we are very careful about things we do and do not say, because we could very well know that we're going to be testing certain matchups in a week. And if we talk about a certain deck, we could have a very different opinion in 2 days' time. So we might not talk about that because we just don't know, right? And we don't want to mislead people and say X, Y, Z. Sometimes we'll also get things wrong,
Yeah,
which
a
we're
lot,
going
to
to
be
do.
honest.
We're going to be wrong about things like Prism, for instance, or like certain things where we might not think something is good. It's not performing in our testing, and we'll be very open and honest about that. But other people could prove us wrong. Other people find different things, test different ways, find different card combinations, which is all part of the game of Flesh and Blood. So anyway, I just thought this was a great question. I thought it was a great time to address it because I know it's something that continues to come up in the community, not just for ourselves, not just for Tariq, but for others as well. And as this community grows, it's something that's come up in Magic content for ages. It's something that's come up in pro gaming content for a very long time. But I think we have an amazing community, and I think for the most part, people really understand that we're being very open and honest about the things that we know and our opinions, and in very, very certain terms, never trying to mislead people, and neither do I think has Tariq.
Yeah, but on a lighter side, the knick-knack brack meme is freaking hilarious. So I saw on Twitter yesterday, Tariq was like testing. He's like testing Datadol and Blitz, and he did like the eye emoji, and someone was like, "All right, calm down, knick-knack and brack." Oh god, it was such a good reply. I think it was Tyler Horspool who actually wrote that.
Brilliant, love it.
All right,
All right,
Hayden.
Brendan, where to next?
Well,
I have to introduce you. Where are we going to next? Are we going to be bringing a doctor on the show?
Yep, we got to go pick up the doctor. Go pick him up after work, and yeah, let's go grab Tariq and dive into this main topic of the pod, which is Flesh and Blood set design and sort of the future. All right, welcome back, the doctor, Mr. Tariq Patel. You mentioned you just came off the golf course. You want to sort of recount that story in your professional golf career?
Nothing really to tell. I just had a good time. Golfing is kind of my relaxation method, and I was just out there playing. Shot a 78, so it was a good day, and I played well, and now we're back home to talk about Flesh and Blood. So I'm ready if you guys are.
Absolutely. Well, we're happy to have Mr. Knick-Knack and Brick-a-Brack himself on the podcast. We actually had a Command and Cookout question sort of in that light, which I think you'll enjoy the answer to. We sort of had a similar running in back in the early days of Arsenal Pass, and yeah, I don't know, it's interesting. And I remember your post on Twitter yesterday about Datadol, and that comment, I think it was from Tyler Horspool, actually made me laugh out loud in public. It
made me laugh too.
All right, but anyway, yeah, so we're going to be talking about Flesh and Blood game design in the future. So, Tariq, you mentioned you had a lot of thoughts, you had a lot of notes on this. Do you kind of want to open it up with sort of what is your understanding of the current state of Flesh and Blood, and just a quick thought on like scalability, sort of the foundation of the game's design and where we're heading in the future? I know it's a big question, but I wanted you to just kind of give your primer for that topic.
Sure. So let's start with first principles and where kind of Flesh and Blood is on a turn-by-turn basis, and then what decks can do from there. So when I look at a game of Flesh and Blood, it is defined by the rules where every player must drop to 4 cards every turn, and you have 1 arsenal slot. So when breaking down decks, 5 cards is really the maximum that either player really has to work with on at the start of each given turn cycle. So when I look at it, I look at cards and decks in a way that, an Oldham deck or a Guardian deck in general can block 3 times 5 worth of points maximum every turn, so 15 damage. And on the other side of it, I value every attacking card as a base average of about 3.5 to 4. So every deck that attacks, every card that they can possibly put out is about 4 times 4 times 5 is 20 damage a turn, and then I start breaking it down from there. So I apologize for my dog, she is easily excited. But so when asking the question, is Flesh and Blood fully fleshed out, I like to start with the basics of what every deck can potentially do every turn, and where they're going in terms of offensive versus defensive values, and then going from there.
How do you think we end it? So I would argue that since Monarch, we sort of exist in this hyper-polarized format of very aggressive decks, and usually in that case, a premier singular aggressive deck, aka what everybody considers to be the best deck, also polarized by a hyper-defensive deck in the format. So in Monarch, we saw this with Chain and then Fatigue. Fatigue came in a few different flavors, right? But mostly in the form of Prism. As we move forward from there, we do still have Chain, but now we're looking at we're looking at things like Briar versus Oldhim. That was sort of a good example of that. Starvo kind of broke that open, right? It did, but I would put Starvo into the bucket of an aggressive deck. I know Michael's deck in particular was a different take on that, but sort of also a polarized meta where it was very much Starvo and Prism. And of course, we ran into the PT, where we have, with Awakening Band, we have sort of this hyper aggressive deck, or these two Premier. We actually had a duality of Premier hyper aggressive decks, I think, in the form of both Chain and Bravo Star of the Show. We did see Fatigue show up. We did see hyper defensive decks show up, but not as much as usual. And of course, Prism came back. Prism came back to prey on Starvo and to actually go back to its Monarch roots with Fatiguing Chain for the most part. So tell me how we got to that place. These metas, they felt very, you're on this side of the aisle or on that side of the aisle. And I think somewhere along the line, it does feel like mid-range died. Can you just kind of analyze that for me?
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. In general, with how many cards and how many heroes are available in Flesh and Blood, you would think there'd be more of a spectrum. But I think due to the polarization I think we're seeing is because of decks utilizing the 5-card hands as optimally as possible. So in a sense, if a deck like Briar that has almost all the action points it could ever want with Go Again can output its maximum output, which is 4x5 or 20 damage a turn, why would you ever play a game of somewhere in the middle? And I think, I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm saying when you're looking at decks to play, why wouldn't you tend towards the extremes? And in my opinion, when I'm looking at things like this, I'm looking at decks like Guardian, Oldhim specifically, and then decks like Chain and Briar on the other end that are just really good at their extreme aspects. And it's kind of asking the very tough question for every other deck in the format of, what are you doing better than the extremes? And there are certain decks out there like Prism that have the option of carrying damage throughout turn cycles in the form of permanents like Illusionist Auras or Spectre Shields and so forth. And there's other heroes like Dash that can also do that through Mechanologist items. But for a large subset of other heroes, like let's say Hayden's beloved Levia or Rhinar, that just isn't the case. If their damage output is less than let's say Briar was last format or Chain is this format, but they're also subsequently worse at blocking, they have the very tough question of answering, to a competitive player, why should I be the one taken to an event over, the extremes?
Mm-hmm. There's this idea of mid-range, right? And I think one of the problems I have with talking about mid-range and Flesh and Blood is it's not the same as in other games. Like, I don't think mid-range really exists in this game. And you could say that maybe it did in previous formats like Welcome to Wraith, and you talked about Dash just there, obviously the premier deck through Arcane Rising and even to Crucible. I think literally if you talk about what mid-range in this game is, to me it means a deck that more so plays on the board. So I think Prism personally is a mid-range deck. That's what, if I don't think basically I don't think mid-range exists, but if I was to try and attribute something close to it, it would be something that does something on the board and can play in both worlds, which is like a Prism to me, is a deck that can play maybe Channel Lake Frigids, these things that can be somewhat disruptive, Dash with items. I think this is where it plays, and I think often these decks need to flex between being aggressive or being defensive. That's kind of the job they have to try and do to be competitive, and that's really tough. That's where I think it makes it even harder. But I don't think that really we're ever going to see a true mid-range like you see in Magic the Gathering or in other games. I think it's going to look something different because basically the thing you say, Tariq, which is the rule of fours, which is really important in this game, and the idea that you need to break the maximum of a 5-card hand. And the reason you would play a deck that does that, say like a Prism or a Rhinar as a good example, Rhinar has like a turn, right? You have Blood Rush Bellows. You have a turn that can break a 5-card hand and can break a damage threshold. But there's 3 cards in the deck that can do it, and it requires certain other things around it, right? So my thing would be to go outside of that, you have to break some of the tenets of the game, and that starts to become dangerous. So it's really hard for, I think, the game design to find a spot where it makes sense to do it. And I think that's kind of honestly, I think that's the dilemma that LSS are in, is how do you do it while not breaking the game?
Yeah. I want to take a small detour just to quickly talk about armor and this concept of bridge. How do you think that has impacted some of the premier heroes in Flesh and Blood? It feels like some of the better heroes in the game, or the more consistently performing do have access to a large amount of armor, right? Allowing them to block, critical on hit triggers, things like command and conquer, things that threaten disruption with, permanent things on the board and not actually taking a card out of their hand, allowing them either attack back. Obviously in Oldham's case, maybe they're actually opting for a more defensive overall. But particularly in the aggro decks, it does seem like access to a high amount of armor or a quote unquote fridge seems imperative to actually being competitive. Do you agree with this?
100%. And I think that is probably the area that LSS has room to explore the most for buffing or even nerfing, other heroes. Because, for example, if you walk over to a game of Flesh and Blood and you did not know what happened the turn cycle prior, the only thing that you could get from the game by looking at it is A, the life total, and B, the state of the armor. Right. And that's why when I, try and help my friends that are coming over from Magic to play Flesh and Blood, and they just had, their opponent just had a really good turn against them, or they had a really bad turn, I can almost tell them, like, pretend you have amnesia and you didn't know what happened the turn before. You're really only down 4 life points, or, a counter on this piece of armor. And if you look at the game with almost like amnesia every turn, the permanence of the game is only really reflected in your life total and armor. And the fact that some heroes and some, classes have way better armor, Runeblade having grasp is just absolutely, crazy. Where Dash, for example, still doesn't have a playable arm piece is just an absolute crucial difference when you're picking decks, because you can build a very, very good aggro Dash deck, but it's lacking that critical arm piece. And maybe if it had a grasp of the Arknight equivalent to Dash and didn't have to run the generics, it would see more play. So I think it's extremely important to have good armor, and it's an area that LSS needs to explore a little bit more.
It's the most interesting part to me, to be honest, because it's the part that always, like you say, always starts on the board. But it's also a place where you can have single use things that only can happen once in the game. You take Bloodtooth Skalata, you take Courage of Bladehole, you take these cards that have one-time effects, right? To me, those are some of the most interesting things in the game, because yes, they start on the board and they're a powerful effect, but they do have a limit to them, and that's like really interesting design space to me. Just outside of even what defending and what basically defensive armor you have. This idea of activated abilities or triggered abilities, the ones that cause me concern are cards like Crown of Seeds, cards like Rampart of the Ram's Head, where they have this repetitive effect that I think can warp basically how the game's played, and effectively lead towards being able to break tenets of the game, which does cause me some issues. Like I think Crown of Seeds personally is a bigger problem than a card like Bloodtooth Skalata for the long term of the game. So that's an interesting part of the design space. I think they both really interesting to explore, but also really need to understand and be careful of.
Mm-hmm. So modern day Flesh and Blood and modern day card design, new sets. Let's particularly look at Everfest. What actually makes the cut? Looking at Everfest, we saw some winners and some losers, right? And we actually saw a lot of game design space not get utilized, particularly in the potion slot. So what does it take to be kind of a good enough card out of some of these supplemental sets? Does it just have to have that Runeblade keyword on it and somehow slot into these already extremely powerful decks like Viscerai was, or Chain, or Briar, or Illusionist, Guardian, things like that? Because I think in Everfest we saw some really interesting takes on some cards like Revel and Runeblood. That is a very different card from what we're used to, and its power level in Viscerai was ridiculous. Swarming Gloomveil, sort of the same thing. Miraging Metamorph, this almost delete 7 life from your opponent kind of card. What does it take to be at the highest level, be at the highest competitive level, be relevant, and sort of actually change that class's ability to be viable in a competitive format?
So I'm going to give you an opinion here, and it's going to be a take that might be a little bit of a hot take, or one that others may have not, realized before, or may disagree strongly with. But I think in Flesh and Blood, the cards by and large are extremely underpowered. And I think that's by intention design. But I think by and large, everything in every class is relatively underpowered. And we see that with potions, right? When I saw the first kind of couple potions come forward, I was kind of like, but I'm like excited, because Time Snap potion is phenomenal. Energy potions are phenomenal. The ability to bring action points, resources, or damage through turn cycles and not be constricted to one turn cycle is absolutely imperative to, for XYZ strategies. And I'm like, okay, great. Here's another way to do it that's more generic in potions and for any other class. but they were all very, tempered down. And we see that with LSS's design with all the card draw mechanics. You think of cash out, cash in, everything is slightly overpriced for the amount of cards you would draw. And there's no way to break it in a way to like draw your whole deck or get, a larger, a greater sum than the parts. And I think that's intentionally by design. So when we're looking at cards that are overpowered or standout, I think it's a very low barrier. The cards like Revel and Runeblood you mentioned, for example, I think they're actually well-designed cards and they're actually perfectly fine, right? On face value, it is a 0 resource cost for 4 damage, which is, it's slightly above average, but it's a majestic level powered card. It's not like it's absurd in any way. It has the downside of being a red line card, meaning it's a horrible pitch card. And I think we see this that chain players aren't even playing it right now in up-to-date chain list. And it was specifically good in Viscerai because of its synergy with Viscerai's other abilities, Scalata and so forth. And that's why it really felt pushed in that format when Viscerai was there. But I like to honestly sit down and look at Flesh and Blood and go, the cards that we think are too good are only too good relative to the format because other cards are so underwhelming. And that, in actuality, if other decks just had other resources to compete with it, they may not actually be overpowered or pushed.
I massively agree with you, Tariq. Like that's one of the biggest points of this game. I think is that the only thing I would say maybe I like slightly disagree with is the power level of certain cards only being synergistic, and I actually think those come from earlier sets, not from current sets. But a card like Plunderon, a card like Tomofi and Dell, like there's these cards that potentially could have are just very strong because of what they do in terms of just what the printing says on the card. Whereas I think with like Everfest, I don't really feel that about any card in particular, like Revelin, Runeblood, Swimming Gloomvale. I agree with you. I think these cards are like really well designed and really well balanced. Where the strength comes from is like the synergy, like you say. What I actually think we're going to see is like there's a lot of really powerful effects in the first 2 sets. Energy Potion is ridiculously powerful, I think, and Time Snap Potion, like you say. I think these cards, these first 2 sets, are going to really permeate through the game for a long time, and they're going to have a really long tail. I don't think we're actually going to see, I think, the inverse to other games where you see like the earlier sets really get power crept quite quickly and become less relevant apart from a handful of cards. I think you see the opposite. You've got Sink Belows, Fates for Scenes, these 0 for 4s. These are not effects you're going to see through the game regularly. I think what LSS had to do with the printing of the first 2 sets is really set a baseline for cards that are really important for the longevity of the game, and especially for the early parts of the game to have these effects that are sort of asymmetric in some ways, a Scar for a Scar versus a Sink Below, for instance, a Snatch versus a Fate for Scene, whatever it is, to be available in the game to allow players to deck build, to design, and to have these things. And I think they're going to be there for the long term, which raises a whole lot of other issues with printing and things like that. But that's how I kind of see it. I take what you're saying, Tariq, and just think that those first 2 sets are so important for that reason. And maybe some of those are kind of the upper limit of what we see. And in theory, we shouldn't get too much crazy power creep because of the core tenets of the game, right? Because of the rule of 4, because of these things. It's going to come from synergy, and it's going to come from armor, to be honest.
Yeah. So does Rosetta Thorn fall in that bucket? So Rosetta Thorn, a weapon that pretty much just negates every other Runeblade weapon option out there, right? Just almost strictly better in every single way. Has the sort of memey downside of, you've had to play a non-attack action and so to actually get its ability, but effectively a 1 for 4 that has arcane damage that is not Runeblade typical, right? It's a source of 2 physical as well. Sometimes inconvenient to block if you're blocking with a block 3. Do you think that Rosetta Thorn falls in that bucket that you mentioned, Tariq?
I think Rosetta Thorn, I mean, it's hard to say. 1 resource for 4 damage split, 2 ways with a restricted cost attached to it. I think in design theory, I think that's an appropriate, costed thing, right? 1 for 4, no go again, has a restriction. Whether, it restricts other weapons and people being upset, or whether it's right or wrong, I think is a different area to talk about. I think in every kind of game, there will be a most optimal strategy, and people will tend to gravitate towards that anyway. So even if Rosetta Thorn didn't exist, would be having this exact conversation about maybe Nebula Blade or whatever other weapon was in its place. So the fact that it was Rosetta Thorn and not something else doesn't, read too much into it, and I think Rosetta Thorn is more or less okay. One resource for 4 damage, and I think a lot of the other hero weapons out there kind of provide similar rates. We look at Dash's weapon when she fully powers up. It's like a 1 for 4, 1 for 6. Luminar's has a great ability in of itself, and it goes from there. But yeah.
The last
Those are the
individual.
cards that,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just
Aiden.
gonna say, those are the cards that can break it though, right? These ones that start on the board, they're the hardest. You can have design theory, but in the end, it might not matter. These are the ones that can. There's great design theory behind Crown of Seeds, right?
That's I was going to say.
damage prevention.
One more card I want to harp on is Crown of Seeds. This is Crown of Seeds. That ability, a bit atypical, a bit atypically powerful. Maybe not, in the context of the upcoming set Uprising, right? Maybe we'll see more cards sort of on that level. But Crown of Seeds, not only powerful in and of itself in a vacuum, what its ability is allowing you to do, kind of recycle your arsenal into your hand, have multiple blocking cards, have resources floating for the arcane damage, maybe go off Tunic and play the 5-card hand. But the synergy of Crown of Seeds, and then sort of the secondary ancillary effect of turbo stacking your deck, quite good, right? And this additional ability to block arcane damage, very good against Wizard with these multiplicative arcane effects. Crown of Seeds, how does that fit into the sort of the design space of Flesh and Blood? Because I feel like it's kind of outside, right? I feel like it's a bit atypical.
I agree with what Hayden said earlier. I think, and one, a couple weeks ago or months ago now, when we were talking about what cards would you ban to fix Starvo, Crown of Seeds was actually on my list because I first see that card being a problem, 2, 3, 4 sets down the line. And I agree with everything Hayden said before. And I think, Brendan, you hit the nail on the head too, right? It is a card that basically turns a 4-card blocking hand, which used to be the maximum you could block with unless you had a defense reaction. It makes every card you put in an arsenal basically a defense reaction. Maybe like it's a yellow Fate Foreseen or whatever, where it only blocks for 3, but it basically turns your arsenal always into a blockable or useful card. And I want to clarify earlier, don't get me wrong. When I say I think cards are powerful relative to the weakness of other cards, there are sometimes still cards that will be too good for this game. I think Scalata was a perfect example of that card, of that idea that would restrict future card design if they ever kind of presented another X type spell, because that cost reduction is always a way to, any card that cheats an axiom, and one of the axioms being resources, has the potential to being too good. And Crown of Seeds, just like you said, the cheating the way an arsenal is supposed to be used, right? The game's designed so that the arsenal is supposed to be used for attacks and D-reacts only, and Crown of Seeds kind of breaks that dichotomy by allowing any generic card placed in it to actually turn into a blocker. And so yes, I do agree with you that Crown of Seeds is probably too good in a vacuum, not even comparatively to the rest of Flesh and Blood.
Gonna get an opinion piece from you both. Tariq, I know this is going to be interesting, particularly because I know, Tariq, you came into the game a little bit later. Hayden, obviously, you started back early days, IRA days, before, sort of Welcome to Wraith, ground floor. Do you think that as you've came into the game initially and where you are now, has the game evolved in a objectively better way, or has it maybe become less fun, and is there less competitive integrity?
I'll let Hayden say first because he's been playing for a lot longer than I have, and I have some opinions. So go ahead.
Small question. There's a lot to break down there. So you're effectively asking, has the game evolved to be fun, or has it evolved in a good way? Like, what's the?
You can answer both questions, right? Is it more fun, and is it more? Yeah. Is the competitive integrity lower or higher? Right? Do you feel like the work you put in, the practice is leads to more? I don't know, sort of results, wins, etc.
The answer is yes and no.
Yeah.
Because I think, like you say, the work you put in, the integrity of the game from like a purely the ability I have to impact through pure play of the game. Yeah, the agency has lessened, I think, and I don't think there's many people that would argue with that from Welcome to Wraith to where we are now with Everfest. But do I think that's a bad thing? No, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think there's a limit to it. I think there's a scale of how far you should swing the pendulum on those things in terms of like how far you should take away, how much, I guess people talk about variance, right? That's the element people talk about, how much variance you should add into things. Variance is something that came up a lot during this last one, a lot heading into the PT, was things like Star of the Show with Chain, because you have these banishes on shackles, you have star of the show activation. You have these different things. So I think that's something that's coming up more and more as a conversation piece. I think it's true, but I also don't think it's bad for the game. I actually think it's mostly a positive thing for the game. There's negative aspects for sure, but I think the fact that you have the ability to play a game and feel like, oh, I got a little bit unlucky or I got a little bit lucky is a good thing. Like, if you want to go and play, and people, this is, I guess, a tired analogy now, but if you want to go and play chess, go and play chess, right? Like, I think the good thing about Flesh and Blood as we go, or any TCG, yes, reduced variance is good. I love the fact that we don't have to worry about a mana base in Flesh and Blood to a degree. You do have a resource base, right? And that is important. But the fact I don't necessarily get, and I know Tariq's going to put on this because of like, you can draw all quad red hands, you can draw all blue hands, etc. But the rate at which that happens comparative to the impact of a game state where you're building up in a game as opposed to playing hand to hand is very different, I think. So I think in terms of competitive integrity, I think it's pretty good. I think there's definitely elements and there's aspects that are, I would say on watch, I would say on notice about being really careful about, and the game has definitely had more variance come into it. But overall, I think it's a positive thing for the game. But you ask me in 3 months' time, and my view might change.
You know what's funny is the last time we talked, I think Hayden actually changed my mind on this, and I actually agree with Hayden now. I actually really enjoyed the last format, so I'm going to be an LSS shill. And actually, I don't think the last two formats we played were the worst. I think for me, the game still evolved in a way that I've had fun and I've learned a ton of things. Going into from the Briar format to the Viscerai format to the what we had now at the PT format. I've still learned a ton of stuff, and I thought it was very fun. And I think it gets a lot more flack than it probably deserves. Was it perfect? No, I think everybody can say the dominated Oakenolds were not the most fun play pattern to play with or against, but there was a lot to really go over, especially in the Starvo mirror match. Right, there are a lot of matches over Pro Tour and the calling weekend for myself where I just was dead in the water to multiple activations in a row. But there were a lot more games where I finally got to utilize that skill set of setting up a great second cycle. That's something that I'd only heard about ever from boomer players like yourself, and I never really got to experience like in the other formats. So a lot of my games over the weekend actually came down to who set up like an Earth, Ice, Lightning, second cycle better than their opponent. And when it got to that state, I felt very comfortable playing the Starvo matchups. And there is some amount of variance with like Hayden was saying with Soul Shackles and Oakenold reveals, but it goes both ways. And I've played worse formats in other games, and this one didn't actually feel too bad. We had 3 completely viable decks. We had Kano, which y'all broke and brought to the PT. We had Lexi in Yuki's hand that was absolutely dominating certain decks over the week. Like I thought it was just a really fun format through and through, and a lot of the games were very interesting. But it did have the negative play patterns, and as human beings, that's what we tend to latch onto, right? Humans are very loss adverse, and they tend to pick up on the negative things. But I think the game has evolved in a way, and I think it's still fun and interesting, and I'm excited for what comes next.
All right, so I want to talk about sort of silver bullet matchups and silver bullet cards. Is this actually healthy for Flesh and Blood? So right now we do have classes like Prism, right? Prism against Guardians, like it's been sort of this silver bullet class, right? Guardian just traditionally has like sort of a 90-10, just a particularly bad matchup because its inability to gain action points to actually interact with what Prism has on board to a lesser extent. But it would be felt if Kano was mass adopted. Kano also can't really interact with this deck, and it leads to sort of an ish experience. We've seen this also in Briar versus Oldhim, in the aggro Briar press, and maybe, I guess, Chain versus Midrange. But effectively, matchups that take away player agency, and we get closer to this format of a rock, paper, scissors format, right? And I think that I heard about this concept a lot back in like Welcome to Wraith and Arcane Rising was like, oh, this idyllic rock, paper, scissors format where everything has this sort of this balance. But I think that's actually the opposite of what Flesh and Blood is supposed to be. The idea of bringing a deck, right, that has your goal is to sort of gem format past one hero in order to stomp another hero and maybe edge out your mirrors through play skill. That's the opposite of what Flesh and Blood should be, in my opinion, right? I could be wrong. This could be the future of Flesh and Blood. We've also seen this with cards, right? We've seen some cards that have... Some of these ones have been less effective, though, but some of the item destruction cards, particularly for Dash, we have Rampart of the Ram's Head. We have things like Steadfast for arcane damage. Just really silver bullet-y cards. But particularly I want to focus on the matchups, right? Like things like Prism, things like, defensive old him into aggressive decks like Briar or potentially Chain. Is that the future of Flesh and Blood? Is it healthy? And is that a good game experience?
Hayden, I'll let you go first because I know you guys had a little bit of a back and forth on your last week's episode, and I really enjoyed this topic. And I'll weigh in after because I had some points to make on both you and Brendan. So go ahead.
All right, I'll try and just quickly summarize, I guess, because we had a very similar question about, a polarized matchup's good for the game. Is effectively the question that came out of it. And my short answer was yes. To a degree, I think it is good for the game because I don't actually think in this game. I think it's first of all, I think it's good that we can reward players for being experts in heroes. I think that's good, but I also don't think the game should exclusively reward players for being experts in heroes. And I think there should be especially at a very top competitive level, incentives to be able to play more than one hero, to be able to play multiple classes. And so I think that having some of these polarized matchups, like you say, I mean, I don't even agree, Brendan, that necessarily Guardian has this 10-90 matchup into Prism. I think we've just seen that with the Star of the Show meta. You could say, yeah, Star of the Show is an outlier because of the power of that. But even you can look at Ultim and say, to be honest, you can build that to get it to probably somewhere around a 40-60 matchup. And I think if you ask someone like a Matt Rogers or maybe Tariq has something to say about it, that might be possible. So, but in general, I think these ideas that stock standard builds are good in certain formats and create polarized matchups to a degree. I actually think that's good for the game. I think I want to see the ability to be able to still metagame an event. If we start to reward just the fact that every matchup becomes somewhere between like 40 to 60%, quoting 40 to 60%, somewhere around there, when you say that both players are equally matched, I don't think that's a very exciting format to be in where you can have 10 heroes. I don't actually think that's good for the game long term. And just I think having things rotate in and having heroes be good sometimes not be good is really exciting and causes people to learn new things and discover and find this excitement through deck building, through card discovery, through new sets coming out. So yeah, I actually think that those kind of things are good for the game.
All right, so I'm definitely more on camp or team Brendan here in this particular example or question. I think polarized matchups are rough for the game overall. If you go into a tournament and you have a rock, paper, scissors dynamic where it is a 90-10, 90-10, 90-10, I think it's a very unpleasant experience going into it than knowing that 2/3 of your games will be very hard to win. And I think Flesh and Blood, especially given that it's a one match game, I guess I should say, you only play one match to determine the winner of a round, means that each player starts with 40 life. And the way the game is designed with second cycle and the pitch stacking, etc., means that both players are more than likely to see their entire deck unless you're a hyper aggro deck or your opponent's a hyper aggro deck. And because of that, any good or bad repetitive play patterns that LSS has designed and implemented to the game will be seen throughout the game. So we can go backwards and talk about designing them, but so far as it stands, Hayden, you talk about Prism versus Oldhim. If there's a good repetitive play pattern, it is more than likely that Prism will see it. And it's more than likely that Oldhim will also have its bad draws throughout the game, and those effects kind of compound that lead to these kind of 90-10 matchups. In my perfect view, it's actually what Hayden doesn't want. I would love the rock, paper, scissors analogy to be that, you have good matchups, but they're only 60%, or you have bad matchups and they're only 40%. And you can maybe make up that 20% differential over the board itself. To me, that's a much more enjoyable experience, knowing that 2/3 of my matchups are 40%ers, or 1/3 of my matchups, are 40%ers, but that I have some say over to where that 20% leverage comes in through sequencing, through pitch stacking, through second cycle, through sequencing my cards, whatever it may be. So for me, I think silver bullets, especially if you have silver bullets that are really good against the rest of the format and then just lose against XYZ decks, and then another silver bullet that's also really good against the rest of the format, but then lose to XYZ deck, just like we had in this last format with Chain, Starvo, and Prism. It leads to a very, oh my gosh, I hope I don't play against Prism, or oh my gosh, I hope I don't play against Starvo experience that I think is not conducive to an overall great tournament experience.
And before Hayden brings up Kano, because I think he might, I think Kano is an outlier.
I wasn't going to.
Okay, yeah, I think Kano is definitely an outlier. Yeah, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I'm gonna ask you guys a funny one. And I have a lot of thoughts on this particular topic, but I'm gonna give you the basic question and just let it simmer. Is Living Legend a good system?
I think it's an interesting system, and I'm willing to give it a try. So in other games, you would have rotating formats where new sets come in, old sets kind of come out, and it creates this shift in play. I think Living Legends interesting because it says that the hero itself and not necessarily its card pool may be the issue. Because, for example, if it's the chain cards that are really too good, if you just introduce another Shadow Runeblade, will it just be the next Living Legend? Is an interesting concept to kind of go through. And I think heroes and armor are concepts that other TCGs haven't explored before, and I'm willing to give it a try. So I think Living Legend is interesting for now, but they will have to balance it with how fast heroes get Living Legend, what the appropriate rate is, how many, when the next one will come out. Like Starvo was released in February. We're now sitting here recording this in May, and he's already banned. So there's a lot of question marks about the Living Legend system, but I'm willing to give it a shot.
Yeah, I think in theory it's a great idea. It's a great system in theory. In practice, well, so far I've not been super impressed. But I think we're about to see Chain have I guess what is maybe the idea of Living Legend, and albeit there's been bans that have impacted Chain. But I think we're about to see kind of the first hero, maybe Viserai to an extent, but even that, it was so polarizing. I think the issue with Living Legend is just currently the way that it's being, I guess, basically the execution of it with the point system. It feels like it really depends on how many events are in a season, etc. I don't think that should be the case. I think they should look to move towards a percentage-based system for the season so that points are pretty consistent and the best heroes still gain the most amount of points, but you can kind of have it in this kind of a bit more enclosed idea of how many points any particular hero is going to get, and a bit more paced out. And instead, if they add X amount of events to a calendar, then you don't immediately start to blow out the idea of Living Legend to 4 or 5 heroes a year having it. So I think they need to try and work out how to pace it. I know they've said that they feel pretty confident about it, especially in something like Blitz, because they don't see necessarily more skirmish events being added, but maybe a few here and there. But they feel like they've got a pretty good base now. I don't know. Be interesting to see. But I think in theory, yeah, it's a good system. But in practice so far, I don't know. I'll wait and see. I'll give them, as I say with Tariq, like a benefit of the doubt, right, until we see how it kind of goes. But I think LSS needs to really work on the system a bit.
Yeah, we've had a few iterations actually.
We have,
but I won't go into the history. I will say though that Living Legend, as we know it today, and its specific current iteration will change. It does not work. Living Legend operates, so specifically with the numeric numbers and kind of how things are tallied up, that's a static variable off of a dynamic player base, right? And then a player base that is generally going up. Potentially, if let's say in a situation, I don't think it's likely, the player base drastically goes down, the system also breaks. It breaks both ways. So they will need to recalibrate it, whether that's percentage based or just sort of a rethinking of the entire system altogether. Living Legend will change. It does not actually work, in my opinion, but I think that's going to be pretty close to fact as we see a compounding number of players actually enter Flesh and Blood, which I know we all hope is the future. I do think that this system will change. I'm interested to see both Starvo and Chain potentially get Living Legend and see how that actually impacts the game. Tariq, I think I'll spare the audience my LaCroix metaphor for this one, but I feel like it's pretty accurate. But this could actually really shake things up, and I'm interested to see, because I feel like from Monarch to about now, we've had the idea of things shaking up, we've had the intent, but I haven't really felt it. Speaking of that, Legendary Studios, since Monarch, I mean specifically, has had a heavy hand in the banned and restricted and even suspended list. Do you think that this is a sign of a healthy game? Do you think it's appropriate? Have you been happy with the bans they've had so far? And do you see that as the future of how Flesh and Blood polices its card pool and its formats? Are we going to see active sort of participation from Big Brother, from Legendary Studios, to ban cards and sort of keep our formats healthy?
Yeah, so that's a lot of questions in one. So I'm going to try to break it down and kind of answer it one-on-one. So is, the ban having over the last year or so, having all these bans a good or a bad thing? I have to say, from a player's perspective, it's probably largely positive. I think James White did an interview with, I want to say Flake, where he talks about it, or it might have been Red Zone Rogue. I might be confusing my interviews, but he talks about, the play experience being the number one goal for him and LSS overall. And if there is a negative experience, yeah, it would rotate eventually through Living Legend, but why subject your players to that for X number of months leading up to that? So, the fact that bans happened, I think, is a good thing. Every game in existence, trading card games has had needed bans, and that's because making cards is, difficult. I was almost going to swear there, but it is a difficult thing to make trading cards, and sometimes you miss the mark, and things are better than you anticipate. And there's nothing wrong with admitting you make a mistake. Some people will inevitably be frustrated and lose monetary gains, myself included. I pulled a cold foil dust blade at my pre-release, like my first event, and I was over the moon. And I actually sold it, and then the ban announcement came out, and before I shipped it out, I'm like, yeah, I can't sell that to you. So I reneged on it, and I saved whoever bought it from me some money. So, and like, those things happen, right? And that's why you try and design cards in a way that they hopefully don't get banned. But I think banned and restricted announcements are just a part of the game, and I don't fault them for playing around with design space, and this stuff will inevitably happen. Remind me, what was the second part of the question now? Because there was a lot more to it.
I'd say it's an enigma to me as well at this point because I was listening to you. But just, I think from a macro perspective, is that the future, right? Is active participation and sort of frequent bannings from Legendary Studios. So, and particularly, let's not forget the Pro Tour bannings, right? This sort of this injection to artificially recreate a quote unquote new format, right? Is that the future of Flesh and Blood? Is that a healthy sort of relationship with the publisher? And with a way of balancing the game? Or do you think that we'll see maybe less bannings, less oversight, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And I think it comes down to whether LSS will stick to their guns of being an eternal format, right? You look at another game, specifically Yu-Gi-Oh!, the other big trading card game that has had an eternal format from its inception until present. And inevitably, as the game progresses, there will be strategies that will be too good, and the only thing to do will be to ban them if Living a Legend alone doesn't solve this issue. So, um, you know, to me, it's going to hit a reckoning point for Legend Story Studios on whether or not they are going to be okay with like ever going power creep, just like we saw in the Yu-Gi-Oh card game. And as we're seeing even now, we're seeing, newer and newer heroes push out older and older ones, which kind of in of itself creates a rotating format. A lot of people don't like to talk about it, but how many people that were testing for the Pro Tour really tested, the original WTR heroes, Dorinthia and so forth, or did they just stay with the newer Starvo Chain, Prism, Monarch Plus heroes of late? So in of itself, is that not already a rotating format? And if we're going to keep this eternal format where every card from the existence of or inception of Flesh and Blood is legal, then the only way to kind of create a new cycle of things when better things come along is either going to be power creep or banning. But that opens it up an entirely different can of worms. And I'll give the mic over to Hayden for that one.
I feel like there's a segue coming from Brendan after this, Tariq. He's put us in a corner. But I think basically James White and Legend Story Studios have been really clear about what the use of the Living Legion system is. I think initially not so much, but I think that's been cleared up. Like, it is not a balancing tool, right? That is very clear at this point. It is a freshness tool, effectively. It's a tool to introduce freshness to the game in a non-rotating game, which I think is, in theory, again, genius, but let's see how it plays out. The idea of a band, I mean, every game system has bands. Even if you look at rotating formats, right, Tariq, like Standard and Magic the Gathering has been subject to bans over the years. There was a period where they did a great job with design, I guess, and they didn't need to ban cards. It was really balanced. But it is really hard fundamentally to design a game where it is perfectly balanced. It is so difficult. No matter how many playtesters and devs you have, it's there's always going to be things that crop up, especially as the player base grows. People will find things. So I think bannings and the suspended list as it is now is a reality of the game. I think the suspended list is actually a really good introduction in terms of what they can do with that. Something like Autumn's Touch, for instance, yeah, that really hampers Ultim, right? But Autumn's Touch is about to rotate back in with Stavo going out of the format for Ultim. So there's these bits and pieces. I'll be interested to see how they use the suspended list moving forward. But I think it's going to be a reality regardless as we move forward in a non-rotating game, and even a rotating game is going to have it to some degree. So I think they've clearly made some mistakes. Duskblade being one of them. Even maybe you could say in the Briar era, did they not understand how to balance that format enough? Stavo, like there's these small things, but I think as long as they continue to make sure they understand and adhere to the tenets of their game, things like the rule of 4, they're going to be able to design sets that aren't going to power creep the heck out of the game and introduce things through freshness. Now that leads to a different question, which is, can they continue to do that in the design space and for a long time in a non-rotating game and make it interesting? We'll have to wait and see. But
Mr. Dale, I'm happy you asked, actually. So,
tee you up.
Is an eternal format the future of Flesh and Blood? Or, here's the thing. Keep this in mind, right? I need you to sort of prime your initial knee-jerk reaction with this concept, is that a rotating format, when we talk about it, we're not talking about it being necessary or it being imperative to sort of the growth and competitive integrity of Flesh and Blood. But could a rotating format potentially make the game more interesting, more exciting, and allow for more design, right? And is basically the simple question I want to toss to you, because I didn't mean to prime you guys like that. Unfortunately, I threw some bias in there. But is an eternal format the future of Flesh and Blood? Go.
I want to say it is. I hope it is. And I know LSS has been vocal about this game being an eternal format. And, I honestly do believe that it does have some merit. It is nice that, when players buy cards, they know that this card will be good for, so long as the game is legal. But as long as you have a eternal format that coincides with a rotating format, there's no reason that, in my mind, these both can't exist. Because if, like Yu-Gi-Oh, the only thing you have is an eternal format, you have still a gentleman's agreement to what's actually rotating. In of itself, there's still a rotation, whether or not you want to call it that. So to me, I would rather see a hard rotating format of the last 3 or 4 sets so that they can push the boundaries of design, because that's where the fun is to me, right? And if we're being honest, seeing another reprint of a Nimbleism in a slightly different variation is kind of just like, it is what it is. And I would rather them make mistakes in either being underpowered or overpowered or even lateral, power shifts and miss the mark slightly and then have that just rotate out or ban when needed, rather than the game follow to a more stale kind of thing. People lose interest over time. And, the great thing about a rotating format is it allows mistakes not to compound on each other. Where an eternal format is if mistakes happen, they're kind of there until you either ban it or another card comes out in the future that then makes an old card that was maybe on the fence now broken. And you have this problem of always looking over your shoulder being like, is this okay with thousands of other cards I've now retrospectively printed?
It's such an interesting question, I think. And one of the debates is, first of all, I think we will see this game continue to be an eternal game, and I hope so, because that's one of the reasons that I'm playing this game, to be honest. And that's what LSS have laid out in their foundation of the first few sets. I've bought into that. I've bought into this idea that with the design tenets that they can continue to iterate and innovate and make the game exciting. I mean, people had this conversation in a big way before the talent system was revealed, right? In terms of like, where does design space go next? Are we going to see a perfect example? Tariq used, how many Nimbleisms can you print before it becomes, stale and the same thing? And then the talent system comes in. And I think there's even more design space for Flesh and Blood to explore. Now, at some point, that is going to start to peter out, right? Like, regardless of whether you a believer like me, and I think there's still a lot of design space, at some point that starts to peter out, and you have to make a decision, right, about where you take the game. And I think that is a problem that LSS are going to have to face. I don't think it's a problem they're going to have to face in the next probably 5 years, to be honest, unless something drastic happens, like they deviate from the tenets of the design of the game. They break something with basically a mechanic in the game or a design philosophy in the game, and that could cause issues. Then they're going to have to take a really hard look at what they're going to do with the game moving forward. But if that happens, to be honest, Flesh and Blood is really delicate because of the basically the way that the game is designed and these design principles that they have. Like, it is very delicate. Like, if they do break one of these, it could just break the entire game because of the hero based class based system, and that is like a genuine concern I have. I think they have to be so careful, but I think so far they're doing a pretty good job, even with some of the mistakes that have been made. So yeah, I think we're going to see an eternal format. I hope we do, and I do think it's good for the game. But to your point, I could also see a rotating format coming at some point. I wouldn't be mad about it.
They could exist together, right?
I think they could.
There's an important concept you talked about there, which is sort of the last thing I want to touch on here, which is you said you bought into the game because of that promise, right? It's a big reason why you're playing that game. Would you hold on to that, right? Would you say, no, it has to be eternal, we won't rotate, etc., etc., if you started to see the game suffer as a result of that eternal model, right? Or do you think that you'd be like, okay, we tried it, we had a good idea, we had a vision, maybe it didn't work out. An eternal format and a rotating format could potentially exist together, and there can be competitive events for both. Maybe they go this route of, I guess Magic the Gathering kind of went this route where they had these sort of larger formats that were sort of in regular tournaments, but then they started to kind of not be as featured, right? Things like Legacy, Vintage, they're more fringe at this point. Like, could that be where we go, right? My vision for an eternal format, or for a rotating format, just quickly, and I don't really want to go too deep into it because we're running out of time, but I don't know the specifics. I don't know if this would be right or wrong. You can probably put on hold it within 10 seconds, but say you hard rotate, right? You come out with a core set, 4 heroes. Maybe you have Prism, Kano, a new ninja, and then let's say a new class, like a let's say like a summoner or something, right? Whatever it is. Yeah, like a bard. A bard that doesn't piss everybody off in a UPF tournament. And then you have another set, 4 more heroes. Same kind of model, right? Maybe recycling old ones, taking in old classes, maybe adding in a new class. Doesn't really matter. Then 1 supplemental set, then hard rotate, right? I think that potentially we could really stretch design. We could potentially have much more fun formats, and we could learn a lot of lessons as we go from format to format on sort of what heroes in conjunction with each other create these fun interactive experiences that players enjoy. I'm not saying we're not there right now. We're not saying that Flesh and Blood is not fun, or et cetera, et cetera. But that's sort of my vision, or my first vision. It's the first thing I see. But I absolutely believe, and I think it's foundational to this argument, that these two things would exist together, right? The eternal format and the rotating format would both be competitively viable.
Yeah, and to answer your first part, I would never be upset if LSS changed their mind. It is part of my core belief that as you get new information, so should your mindset change about the things that information provides. So it would be perfectly fine with me if LSS 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever, tomorrow even said, hey, we have more data now. I know we said XYZ, but 1, 2, 3 shows that this, is more enjoyable, and they make a change going forward. So I would never, fault them for it. There inevitably will be some people that would pick up a pitchfork and come at them for breaking a promise. But their only, promise to me is that they're making an enjoyable game. And as so long as they continue to do that, I am okay with whichever avenue they go. I think they've done, and I want to be clear, we are critiquing a lot of things that they're doing, but they have done something that so few games have done before, which is create a viable TCG that has survived in its own right. And more than that, has been a game that not just me, but hundreds and thousands of other people have actively enjoyed thinking about as a pastime. And you're competing for the attention span of thousands of people is such a difficult thing to do, not just in gaming, but in any aspect of the world overall. Companies pay millions of dollars for marketing just for seconds of your attention span. And this game has captivated that just by being a fundamentally amazing game to play. So they're doing a really good job already. And if they find a reason to change something that they previously promised, I'm all on board for that. And I hope they do.
Yeah, I think it's context and execution to your first question, Brendan. Like, would I be okay with it? Would I feel like a promise has been broken? I think there's going to be different reactions, like Tariq says. But for me, it's context and execution, like in terms of how they do it. If it's the right decision for the game, and they execute it in the way that makes sense. Like my concern, right, would be, okay, you bring in a rotating format. How do you devote enough resources to be able to maintain both those formats? We've seen it in games like Magic, and that's a massive game, right? It's been hard for them to be able to balance a limited format, a standard format, and then basically a non-rotating or a longer length format. And they've taken dips at it, right? We saw initially they had like an extended format, then they became like this kind of shorter extended format, then they moved to the modern format, and it's gone through different iterations. And I think that was a good thing for that game, right? Like there is, like Tariq says, as information becomes available and as the game needs to develop, you make the decisions based on that and you communicate it to the player base. And I think as long as LSS do that, they're going to have the support of the majority of the player base. I guess in terms of like the last part, like what does a rotating format potentially look like, or how could it be? The only kind of like concern I have is that one of my favorite things about Flesh and Blood is the card pool and is what we have available to us for design. Now, as sets come out and more sets come out and we move on, that becomes less important, I think. But what I said earlier on, I'm going to come back to this point I made earlier on about the first two sets in particular, but even Crucible, starting up here and being important to this game in a diminishing way, but really it's going to take a long time. It's going to have a really long tail. And I think that's really true. And I think some of the fundamental things that LSS have done in the first few sets have really set this game up for success as an eternal game. And I think that's what's going to basically continue to drive this idea of an eternal game is the foundation that's there. LSS started with really strong design principles and really good grounding in their game, I think. And I think that's going to carry them through and be what's kind of the strength as this game continues to move as an eternal game. And then, yeah, maybe at some point I don't see it, to be honest. I don't see us getting a rotating format. I don't see it happening. But for some reasons that could eventuate as we go down the track, it could.
Yep. Well, Hayden, I hear what you said. I just want to reiterate for the audience. LSS had strong design principles. Really stuck to their guns. Intelligent design, and then they printed Starvo. Just kidding, of course. But
I knew you were going to go to that every time.
Awesome. So, Tariq, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Tariq is one of the more intellectual thinkers in the game, so it's awesome to have him come on and speak his mind on sort of the design. I think he helped me figure out more of what my opinions are just in this conversation. But Tariq, in closing, you are also a content creator. Do you want to shout out, your Twitter, anything you're doing in the space right now? I'm going to actually go ahead and shout one out for you. So I don't know if you guys have ever, experienced the Magic the Gathering history that is the Chlogs or the Paul Chim vlogs, but there is now the Tlogs, which sounds a bit naughty, but these are the Tariq vlogs that he's doing at these tournaments, callings, pro tours. Check them out. This is history. This is how you relive Flesh and Blood vicariously through Mr. Patel here. So yeah, I'm going to let you take it.
Well, thank you for the kind words. And Brendan is right. I have been vlogging my experience at the callings and the Pro Tour, and I plan on doing it in Vegas, which I understand I'll see you there, Brendan. Mm-hmm. So they're just a fun little project of mine. It's weird to think of myself in a content creator way. I still don't fully do it. I merely see myself as a player that's enjoying this game to its full extent, and I'm enjoying the, content creator process, if that's what you want to call it. And the vlogs have been a ton of fun. Just cataloging the experience of the whole Dragon Shield thing was amazing to be a part of. The whole LSS banquet dinner was amazing to be a part of. So if you guys were unfortunately stuck at home or can't travel to France, can't travel to Vegas, I think this is just a fun little thing I'm doing that you guys can come along with. But like Brendan said, Tariq Patel 10 is my Twitter handle, and I write articles over on channelfireball.com. If you want to, get more of my writings or musings, that's where to find me.
I was waiting for you to say, Tariq, when you said Brendan's right. I am the most intellectual thinker in Flesh. Brendan's just happy that we didn't argue.
What? Nah. This. I mean, for the record, I think that this was a healthy discussion, right? We avoided a debate. I felt like we collectively found sort of a more objective truth that we all believe in through conversation, which is a novel concept in today's world. But let's go ahead, Hayden. We're gonna go ahead and close this one out. I know we've run a bit long. Tariq, thank you again, and can't wait to just fucking steal that trophy out of your hands in Vegas.
All right, looking forward to it.
All right, Hayden, with that, let's go ahead and head into our Google review of the week. We've got
Please.
one from Tuss O the Best. All right, this one is probably safe. Thank you so much for the review. But he said, if Johnny Bravo and Australian Seth MacFarlane learned to play TCGs at the top level and decided to make a podcast to help everyone else, this would be it. I was terrible at Flesh and Blood, and now I'm semi-okay at it. After listening to this podcast, I've learned how to think like a pro, what decks and cards you should focus on, and how to style my lettuce. Brendan and Hayden keep you up to date on FAB events, break down top-level events and plays, and host the Cookout section that I still haven't been invited to. If you're looking for the best of the best when it comes to Flesh and Blood podcasts, subscribe to Arsenal Pass immediately. Well, thank you so much for the nice review. I know we got a lot more funny ones in the bank. But yeah, Hayden, if someone wanted to submit another review and try to be featured on the Arsenal Pass podcast, how would they do it?
Oh, easy. ratethispodcast.com/Arsenal Pass. Link is down in the description if you're on YouTube, actually, so you can check it out there. That's it, Brendan. That's going to bring us to the end of the show. Great to have the doctor in the house, Mr. Tariq Patel. Great discussion, I thought. Really interesting. Thank you, Brendan, for, I think, bringing that topic to the table. It's something that you kind of just said, we're doing this, and I was like, okay, I listened to you. Well, let's do it. And I think some really great questions. I think having Tariq on for, like, his perspective is really important. Like, he's someone who is very vocal about the game, but also has come from, like, starting this game more recently than maybe say you or me, and has a different perspective, which I think is really important. So great to have him on. With that said, do want to just put a quick shout out to our YouTube channel. If you aren't already subscribed, this is where we load our deck guides, our deck techs, our podcast goes up there as well. You might be already listening to it there. We do also have other videos that go up there. We did some like limited reviews for the Welcome to Wraith Farewell. We'll do some for Uprising. We do, all sorts of things. Gameplay, we're going to get back some gameplay as well. Other than that, if you do want to head up our Patreon as well and support us, you can get extra content there as well. We do a monthly additional podcast on basically whatever we want, usually a level up topic, but generally just whatever we want to talk about that doesn't fit into our schedule for the main topics of the pods. We do also have whenever we throw up a deck tech, we'll throw up a full deck guide up there as well, so you can check all those out. Dash has gone up, Kano's gone up, Tyler Horsballs, Prism has just gone up as well, so you can check that out. And we're on Twitter. You can see our Twitter handles if you're on YouTube there, just pasted down there, but Brendan APG for the man next to me, and then I'm at Fian_Dale. Come chat to us, all things Flesh and Blood. Fab Twitter's great. I've been enjoying it, so come and get involved in the discourse. Other than that, Brendan, that's all for this week, and we'll see you next week.
Yep.